Holy Gospel according to Luke. And Jesus began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the vineyard, to the tenants, so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him, so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come to destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him that very hour. They perceived that he told this parable against them. But they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be sincere, that they might catch him in something he said, so as to deliver him up to the authority and jurisdiction of the governor. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. One of the most difficult things about talking about a parable is the fact that parables themselves, parables are stories that Jesus has used as an illustration to go ahead and demonstrate what he has said. So telling a story about a story is usually a little bit more difficult. This week, usually we go ahead and we print out little study guides. We didn't this week. I'm just going to trust that people can follow along. Key thing to remember is that I usually like to think in threes because most people who speak like to think in threes. So just be aware of 3 points that are made and listen to me repeat things. Have you ever seen someone so distracted by the institution that they forget the institution's mission itself? We can all think of incidents in our lives, whether it be in relationships or work or government or even the church, where people have done this. And it is easy to point fingers at those people, but forget that sometimes we do the same thing with the institutions that we are a part of. And sometimes we are drawn to institutions for institution's sake. It's hard to point the finger when we take a good examination of ourselves and realize that we may not like the things we're part of if all of a sudden they started doing things that we didn't agree with. I think that's really a huge problem in today's society, don't you? A lot of people are willing to break up relationships with things, break up relationships to things, because the institution is made up of relationships. And people have elevated the institution above the relationships that make those institutions up. We can all think of many examples, but we just don't have time to explore them all. But this problem is exactly what Jesus is trying to get at here in this gospel lesson. I want to be honest with you. A lot of us American Christians want to have the form of religiosity without the relationship to Jesus Christ. We want to have the form of religiosity without the relationship to the people sitting next to us in church. It's hard. It's hard to be in relationship. It requires us to admit when we're wrong. It requires us to think deeply. It requires us to give charity to one another. The people listening to Jesus have been given a great inheritance, haven't they? They have been called out. First, they have been called out in creation. They've been called out with Abraham. They've been called out with Moses. They have been called out throughout their history. They are constantly being called out to be God's people, just as you and I are called to be God's people. The problem is, all of us are tempted to want the inheritance of God without the relationship with God. It was our first problem. It is what led to the fall, and it's been our problem ever since. The good news and bad news of sin is the fact that it is the same problem over and over again. The good news is we should all know what it looks like. The bad news is it still seems to keep haunting us. These religious leaders, and many in Jesus' audience, thought of religion like a cheap knockoff t-shirt. You know, the ones you get when you go to certain cities and you see someone on the street corner giving you those, I'm old enough to remember this from the 90s, I'm sure it's changed, but the hard rock t-shirts were so popular then. And I found that I could get a cheap knockoff version for $5 rather than go into the Hard Rock Cafe. Sure, it has the brand name label, but it's nothing like the real thing. Jesus' parable is a warning against these things. The idolatry of institutions, the snare of comfort zones, the surrender of mission drift. Indeed, this makes up his parable, the idolatry of institutions, the snare of comfort zones, and the allure and surrender to mission drift. Now, our passage here today takes place as Jesus is preaching at the very center of the religious world for him and his people. And so he knows very well that this is going to cut to the core of many hearts. He also knows that people who want to turn the relationship with God into something else are going to be gathered around listening to him as well. He knows that they have given themselves over to institutionalist thinking that put themselves at the center of deciding what is true and what is false, rather than putting God at the center. Institutions are important, don't get me wrong. They give us connections to the past and foundations to build a better future. The issue arises when the structure of an institution becomes more significant than the purpose it's trying to achieve. All of us know when this happens. Suddenly, it becomes more important to have turf wars over an institution than to ask ourselves, now, why is it that we got together? Every institution must face this on a daily basis. And there are points where an institution must come to grips with it forcefully at times. The people that Jesus met here were more concerned with their identity as the people of God than they were motivated by the mission which God had given them. It is at this point that Jesus explains his frustration with this mindset in his parable of the rebellious tenants. We don't actually know what these tenants were thinking. In fact, none of us do. When we look at people who are taking an institution in directions that we think is just crazy, we ask ourselves that same question. What are they thinking? No one knows. It's absurd. Our best guess, though, is that they assumed that because the owner gave them so much freedom, he must have abandoned the property to them. In fact, many religious leaders in Jesus' day, and indeed in our very own day, have just the same mindset. They see their institutions as an outgrowth of their personalities, an outgrowth of their preferences. And in addition to being very possessive of the institutions and their vision of it, they then move into the second problem, becoming comfortable with their own particular way of thinking only, becoming comfortable with the way that things have been going for them, becoming comfortable with the notion that they have been doing just fine for themselves, thank you, and they don't need God coming back and giving them little reminders about what exactly their mission is. Throughout human history, people tend to focus on the outright persecutions that people face, whether they're Christian or not Christian. Whatever they happen to believe in, persecutions are something that grab our attention. But anyone who has studied history understands that something far more dangerous than persecution can occur, and that is comfort. Comfort is often a far more dangerous enemy than outright oppression, because the coercion can happen without our even realizing that it is occurring at all. The tenants in Jesus' story and the Pharisees in Jesus' audience reacted with such hostility because Jesus was reminding them that their institutions didn't actually belong to them. We can all get comfortable with the good things in our lives so much that we begin to take them for granted. The world is full of stories of people who lost their way because they got too comfortable with their routine and became angry when someone challenged the status quo, challenged the ruts that they themselves had fallen into. Worse still, comfort can take us to our third problem. Comfort can take us into mission drift. This is a fancy term for when we lose focus of our missions. If you've ever looked at the autopsy of a failed company, it is when it has adopted mission drift. If you've ever seen a company reorganize itself, you'll notice that rather than focusing on new things, it tries to hone itself back to what it originally started out to fulfill. Mission drift, though, is the great fuzziness, as it were. It's like when, for those of you who may not know this, and I'm sorry, I'm going to talk to the rest of us, it's like when you have to go in for an eye appointment. You have to look through and figure out exactly what it is. You have to make sacrifices in order to see clearly once again. Comfort can lead us to mission drift. The tenants were asked with working the vineyard they had been given, but over time their focus shifted to imagining that the vineyard was theirs to do with as they pleased. The religious leaders of Jesus' day, and even many in the crowd, were guilty of the same complacency. And so they recoiled at the Messiah's demand for a rededication to their mission. It's important to know exactly the words and phrases that Jesus uses here. For he says, the Master will send his beloved Son. How many churches are so fixated on tending their vineyards and pretending they own the vineyards that they don't notice when the Master's Son approaches? When the Master's Son tells them that their vineyard is not their own, that out of God's grace they have been given this wonderful vineyard. And it is to him alone that they owe all obedience and loyalty. Daily we see stories of the dark side of institutions. Daily we hear of people who have moved over some sort of invisible line that they themselves did not even know they crossed, from using an institution for a mission to making the mission their sole mission, making the institution theirs and theirs alone. In losing sight of the mission, they excuse their comfort and they turn the institution itself into an idol. If you and I think, though, we are immune to these same problems, you and I are deeply mistaken. That should cause you pause. But the good news is this: the prescription is found right here in this parable. God does not leave his tenants alone. He does not let them suffer mission drift without calling them to accounts. He calls witnesses. He calls prophets. And ultimately, he will call his own son, his beloved son. Just think what would have happened if those tenants had listened to the beloved son, even after they had ignored and beaten up the previous witnesses. It is, after all, God's intention in this parable that people should listen to his son, his beloved son. And so for you and me, the good news is that the church has this wonderful remedy, that when we get blinded by all of these things, we are to listen to the Son. Listen to his mission. Listen to his call for evangelism to spread the good news, the gospel. The world will not be attracted to another institution solely for the sake of that institution preserving itself. But the world cannot help but listen with wonder when the Son comes and proclaims the good news to them. Amen.